APUS history, Lesson 13, the Jeffersonian Age and the War of 1812, or the Age of Jefferson, Part 2. We'd seen in our previous lesson at great length, after going through Jefferson's domestic and internal policies and legal policies regarding the Supreme Court, we'd seen his foreign policy lead into business that he was not going to be able to solve in 2 terms. At the end of his second term in 1808, he steps down, and James Madison, his Secretary of State, becomes the next president, also an anti-federalist or Democratic Republican president, if you will, having all the beliefs and values of the Democratic Republicans. However, the greater issue during this time, not unlike Washington's administration from a few lessons back, is how to deal with external affairs, how to deal with things beyond the United States. And you'll notice our lessons map now gets us back with a little east-west dynamic here between Europe and the United States. All the green areas on our map represent areas that Napoleon Bonaparte successfully welded into his empire at the height of his powers. You'll notice the one great exception is Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And as such, these were the 2 arch rivals to one another all through this early part of the beginning of the 19th century. The United States, as an independent nation, a neutral independent nation, sought commerce and trade with other nations elsewhere, which was leading to an increasing number of problems for us. These 2 powers engaged in a life and death struggle did not want to see commerce and trade with their rivals take place, because anything that strengthened the rival was bad for them. As such, both sides interfered in our shipping, and the British, to a greater extent, impressed our sailors, seized them, took them, and employed them in the Royal Navy against their will, essentially kidnapping and military enslavement, you could say. The British were in a far better position to do this than the French, even though the French did it some, because as you remember, since 1588, England's had the dominant navy on the planet, and they still have it at this point in 1812. They've got a large naval presence everywhere, so they have in a position to do the most damage to us with this model of impressment. Some 10,000 American sailors, 10,000 American citizens, were impressed and forced into service in the Royal Navy between about 1795 and 1800, or 1812 rather. So Napoleon declares what he calls the Continental System. And what that means is he was going to put an overall blockade on any trade from Europe and any other nation with England. He wants to starve them out. In some ways, this is linkage maybe to what you'll see the Kaiser of Germany try to do in 1917, and Adolf Hitler tried to do of Germany to Britain in 1940. Try to starve them out. The British, for their part, respond by retaliating in kind. The British issue what are known as orders in council, and they return the favor. They say that any nation that trades with Napoleon or the Napoleonic Empire, the British are going to be fully justified and warranted, as they see it, in seizing those cargoes, maybe impressing, maybe not. In any event, seizing those cargoes, not returning them, and using them for their own use. This puts the United States between a rock and a hard place. We're kind of sunk no matter what we do. You recall Jefferson's initial solution was to simply cease all international trade, which had disastrous effects on the economy. And what this wound up doing for the 1808 election is this Federalist Party, which had been dying. They had been unpopular since the 1800 election, Alien Sedition Acts. Resistance to Jefferson's policies actually briefly rejuvenates their strength and brings them back into political relevance. They don't get enough votes to win, but they're a significant player. In the 1804 election, they weren't. They'd been buried by the wildly popular Jefferson after the purchase of Louisiana. Madison comes in and has the same issue to deal with, and his solution is the NonIntercourse Act of 1809. Now, before you giggle too much, intercourse refers to a dialogue or transfer of any item, goods, trade, what have you. So he's essentially going to do an act that says we forbid this intercourse or trade with all these other nations of the globe, but he's going to narrow it this time. Madison's solution is the 2 number 1 nations that are offenders for us are France and Britain. So the Non-Intercourse Act allows American trade with all nations except France and Britain. It just so happens, however, that France and Britain are our number 1 and number 2 largest trading partners during this time. So whereas under Jefferson with the Embargo Act, exports dropped 80%, under this, exports drop, 70%, 75%. It's still that same kind of catastrophic effect on the American economy. And it hurts the same people regionally that it hurt under Jefferson. New England is devastated economically by this. Ships, again, are rotting in the harbors. All sorts of sailors and producers are thrown out of work. Goods are rotting on the wharves. We got nowhere to sell these things. And it leads to an economic downturn in New England. The southern states somewhat, but not as much, because they didn't have an economy that was based as much on this kind of trade. In frustration over the failure of this within Congress, Macons Bill number 2 is proposed in 1810, which would eliminate the Embargo Act in its entirety and take that away as long, or the Non-Intercourse Act, and take it away as long, and open up trade with France and Britain to say, look, we're going to try again. But if any of you decide to not seize our ships, we'll stop trading with the other guy. So it's kind of a way to kind of bribe them to kind of set up and come along. If you respect our neutral rights, we will stop trade with whoever your rival is. This still doesn't get us anywhere, because the Europeans are going to follow a famous foreign policy example of realpolitik, which says necessity knows no law. When you're fighting for survival of your nation state, you don't worry about niceties on the outside and how it might affect or other affect nation states with their collateral damage. And the other European parties essentially don't get involved or don't really buy in and go along with this and agree to the terms of Macons Bill number 2. And ultimately, New England is going to be so frustrated by this that you actually saw rumblings of secession again. The old voices of the Essex junto kind of shake themselves up again a little bit, and Federalist resentments in New England over this leads to a meeting in 1814, the so-called Hartford Convention. Now, if you want to remember linkage, we talked about the idea of nullification being an AP history word, the power and ability for states to nullify federal laws they don't like. It shows up in the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 or 1799 in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. It's never been proven as a doctrine because the Alien and Sedition Acts expire, but they were against a Federalist government. Here you see the Federalists, who are now out of power, who want to use nullification to not follow laws of a democratic republic they don't like, government they don't like. So we've completely inverted. We've put our shoes on the other foot. Those that have the levers of power are now advocating for big muscular government to do things, even though they're Democratic Republicans. And those who are out of power are now trying to advocate for states' rights and reject this large governmental power, even though they're Federalists. So ideology only gets you as far as it gets you. Once real things start hitting you, you'll see these parties reverse and switch their positions. So at the Hartford Convention, representatives from New England, all these federal states, come together with the goal of trying to restrict or limit the impact of the federal government on their region, on their lives, in a measure against what they called the Virginia dynasty. The fact was, besides John Adams, every president of the United States had been a Virginian. Washington, Jefferson for 2 terms, Washington 2 terms, Jefferson 2 terms, Madison a term now. Every president except one guy for 4 years had been a Virginian. And so they wanted to pass a law as part of the Hartford Convention resolving that no state can consecutively elect two presidents. They wanted to limit the power of Congress to make a war. They wanted to limit the power of Congress to have an embargo. They wanted to say that states could nullify it. They wanted to limit the power of Congress to make new states. Remember New England's priorities. Not have all that land open up for yeoman farmers out west in Louisiana Purchase, but keep the population where it was so they could provide the labor that was necessary for the economic engine they were growing. They also wanted to reject the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which was a measure that was thrown in to placate the slave owners of the southern states. Well, the Hartford Convention they passed some resolutions, but they never actually succeeded in taking any measures towards secession or towards any of these things. They were simply resolutions of suggestions they had. For reasons that will become apparent a bit later on in this lesson, the Hartford Convention becomes a dead letter. In any event, though, Madison finally feels that American options are limited enough that he's going to have to go to war. And this is a fantastic decision for a Democratic Republican president to make, for any president to make, in a nation that's only about 20 or 30 years old, that's been living by George Washington's policy of don't get entangled in foreign affairs because it could destroy our nation. He's going to declare war against Britain. And you can probably think from your world history class why that might not really be an intelligent measure. You remember from your earlier units in Get a 5 or your earlier units in your history class, Britain was the possessor, the ruler of the world's largest global empire. Is it really prudent from a military standpoint for the United States, this fledgling little nation, to go and take them on, to actually declare war against this massive entity? And the answer is a resounding no, and the United States was ill-prepared for war, and the war was thoroughly mismanaged and ill-managed by Americans all the way around. Our saving grace was that for the bulk of that wartime experience, England had a knife at its throat in the form of the Napoleonic Empire 12 miles away, or 8 miles away across the Dover Straits. England had far more pressing concerns that could not deploy their full weight to bear against us.